I had like this attic room and there was a connection for a phone. And I just saw, oh, well, yeah, the extension for the phone. So I plugged in the phone, right? And it turned out that whoever was living in that room was actually like an escort, okay? That had like their separate line that went to that room, okay? Because one day I picked up the phone and it was some guy calling to set up, a situation like that. So I was like, oh, okay, there's this phone number. So I just used that phone number to book like an entire tour.
Welcome to The Creative Asylum, a weekly podcast that digs deep into the minds of visionary creators of all stripes. Musicians, actors, filmmakers, writers, artists, cartoonists, and cultural disruptors. Here, we'll discuss perspectives of living life on your own terms. Life lessons that keep us grounded, insane, and sometimes pull us back from the edge. So, take a deep breath, loosen your grip on the bland and the boring. This is your weekly prescription for authentic living, creative clarity, and hopefully, a little bit of cultural rebellion.
Side effects may include spontaneous joy, existential epiphanies, and an uncontrollable urge to do weird and beautiful things.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Creative Asylum. I'm your host, Daniel House, and today's guest is Michael Hill. He is the frontman of the band Tombs. You may or may not know them. I don't know. They're loud, they're heavy, they're dark, they're intense. He's also a host of the Everything Went Black podcast, which is similar to this in that he has conversations with a lot of different kinds of creative people and creative thinkers. He also has a second podcast called Necromaniacs. That is a podcast devoted to horror and his love for horror films. I first got to know him because he was a host with a friend of his of another podcast, Metal Matters. And I just kind of stumbled into an episode that they had done about the second record by my old band, Skinyard, from 1988. And I was like, wow, this is really great. So I reached out to him and ended up being a guest on his podcast. And we got to be friends through this whole process. His whole life is basically devoted towards creativity, be it music, be it writing, be it his podcasts. He's one of those people that, has many irons in many fires and also is very much a deep thinker. And he's somebody I really enjoy having conversations with, which is why I wanted to have him here on the Creative Asylum. So without any further ado, let's get over to the conversation with Michael Hill. Michael Hill. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Greetings, Daniel. It's a pleasure being invited to be part of this. It's last few episodes I listened to have been very good. I'm really interested.
Yeah, I'm glad you're listening. And I'm glad you agreed to take part. You and I first met because of one of your older podcasts. I don't think it was one of the current ones.
Actually, you're right. It was probably the Metal Matters thing I did.
Yeah. That's
the
it.
Defunct Metal Matters. That was through Gimme Radio. Yeah.
But still, that was such a cool thing. Just sort of stumbling randomly onto this podcast episode about a record that, I was on that came out in 1988. And I was like, wow, this is cool. And so I listened to it and I was like, they've really done their research. They know a fair bit about this. And then so, I just reached out and said, hey, and then ended up on your podcast.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was so cool. And I've I never really thought before that you can actually connect with people through podcasts in whole different ways. And I've actually, made a couple of friends through podcasts and you're one of them, so we've gotten to know each other a little bit. And I know now you have a couple of different podcasts currently, Everything Went Black and Necromaniacs, and I discover then that you've been playing loud, heavy music for a very long time. And then I also find out that you and I are very aligned in terms of politics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And, these are all things I'd like to talk about
Sure.
In this conversation. Politics increasingly more and more, I think, is going to slowly seep into this podcast just because I think creativity regardless is, or at least should be, an inherently kind of political act.
Well, especially since the current administration is trying to crack down on free speech and
Uh-huh.
free expression and creativity are go hand in hand. So, if you have to like be aware of being prosecuted or, you know, a bunch of goons kick your door down and throw you in a concentration camp because of something you say, that's like something that definitely stands in the way of creativity.
It is. But I also think these are actions of people who are, in fact, inherently weak. They portray this facade of strong, tough men, and they're actually just a bunch of chicken shits. Otherwise, they wouldn't be threatened by people's opinions,
Well, I
right?
100% agree with that. Go back through history, like all of these like self-styled strongmen, totalitarians are. Even Vladimir Putin's not popular in Russia. You know what I mean? He's not,
No.
but he fixes everything so that he wins these quote unquote elections every year or however many years they
Right.
have them. It's definitely coming from a place of weakness. Even the desire to completely control people,
Well, it's
perspective.
based in fear.
Yeah, it's based in
If
fear, and
if
it's a weak position to have in general, I think.
Well, we'll talk more about
No,
this. Let's
totally.
going back to that first Metal Matters podcast and then becoming aware of a lot of the music that you create. I was interested at the time because it's like you're much more of a full-blown kind of metal guy, but then clearly and obviously you had tastes that went well beyond that. I don't know. I guess I'm wondering where along your path of musical discovery have you always been a metal guy or did you become a metal guy? And then with that, was there a certain point at which you began sort of plumbing the depths of other kinds of music that aren't necessarily within your, that limited genre? And I'm not assuming that metalheads are only into metal or, that indie rock people are only into indie rock. And, I have the most ridiculously broad taste in music myself. And so I always love it when I come across people who themselves also are really broad in their tastes.
Yeah, I started out listening, hard rock and heavy metal, more so than anything else, really. Really originally I listened to the music my parents listened to, which was like Roy Orbison and like, like 50s girl groups and stuff like that. And I still to this day love that music from that era.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Judas Priest, Rush, Black
Hmm.
Sabbath, like all that. That was like my early love of music. That's when things really started resonating with me creatively, And I'm a self-taught guitar player. Like I just figured Sabbath. I picked up the guitar and I was figuring out the songs on like one string, and kind of going, didn't know what chords were or any of that sort of thing. And then like I started learning how to play just by emulating other people who knew how to play.
Hmm.
And then it wasn't until I saw, Repo Man the movie
Ah,
Repo Man,
oh,
then I was like,
yes.
"Oh, there's like this whole other thing going on here." And there's like a band called Black Flag. And then I started keying in with certain people that were in my school. Like, I was still in high school, Like one kid came back from California one year and he had that, the Let Them Eat Jelly Beans, compilation. And then we
Uh-huh.
all took our cassette versions of that and from there it was like, into like, for me, the hardcore that I liked was like Black Flag and a
Uh-huh.
lot of the West Coast stuff. I didn't really connect with any of the stuff because I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. So a lot of the East Coast hardcore stuff I never really got down with. It was just too like,
Huh.
yeah, I grew up in the hinterlands. I grew up in, outside of the city. Like I wasn't, Lower East Side, kid, what I mean? That, this rough and tumble background. I took the train into the city and, I started seeing bands like X and the Cramps and I saw Dead
Uh-huh.
Kennedys, stuff like that. And that's when it kind of opened me up to, different types of, music, like the punk hardcore stuff.
Right.
But the bands that I liked that were in that era, like Black Flag to me sounds like a metal band, really,
Hmm.
especially the later material they were doing.
Yeah. Right.
And, Fast Black Sabbath was, I think I referred to them like when I discovered them one day and, it was the Rollins era stuff. But, late 80s into the 90s, there was I feel like there were a lot of bands that, if you were someone who sought music out, you could, go to the different record stores that specialized in certain things and you could start like adding layers to the onion, you know what I mean? Like you could,
Sure.
oh yeah, there's this band Skin Yard. That's a cool name. Hallowed Ground. That sounds like something I should check out, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sound,
And also back then, the people in record stores are,
Oh,
Probably their greatest
absolutely.
joy was like, have you heard this? Have you heard this? Have you heard this? You're
Well,
right.
well, there
You
was a
know,
there
like,
was a record store. It used to be in Danbury, Connecticut, which is like close by to where I grew up, called Trash American Style. And you could talk to anyone in the Northeast, Boston, New York City, Connecticut, that grew up in that era, the late '80s into the '90s. And the store lasted until the 21st, into the 2000s. And they'll know about that place. It'll be like, oh yeah, Malcolm Tent, the guy who ran that spot. Like, he was like an encyclopedia, but he also added this, like, very unique flavor to things because he had this, like, you can buy, like, all the cool stuff from Revelation or whatever, you can get, like,
uh
all this cool, like, independent music, but he also had, like, Gun Club records too, and
right.
he would check you out, and be like, "Alright, you like these kinds of things," and it's like, "Well, if you like this band, you should check out Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds or whatever, or The Birthday Party,"
Right.
if you like you like Scratch Acid, cool. Check out The Birthday Party.
It almost seems like you should, if you have a record store, it should be your like contractual obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. So playing, like being in bands, because I said that, I was a, self-taught guitar player, so,
How old were you when you started teaching yourself?
probably like 12 or 13.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I
Really?
was like,
Okay.
I was always actually, not to pat myself on the back, but I was always very musical, like, even in
Uh-huh.
grade school, like, I played clarinet, trumpet, and when I
Uh-huh.
was like 10 years old or whatever, like I
Right.
started playing in the various like musical ensembles that they had in school, right? So I always had this proclivity for music, something I felt, and something that I had an aptitude to learn, to whatever degree. So yeah, I started being interested in these bands, like AC/DC and Black Sabbath, and I talked my parents into getting me a guitar and a little practice amp, and they were down because they knew that I took music seriously. Like, they knew that, like, if I was going to get something like this, to get into this thing, I was going to do it for real. Like, I
You were going to
wasn't
do it.
going to
Sure.
just play around and forget about it. Playing in bands, like I said, I wasn't taking guitar lessons from some dude who can play Van Halen solos. So I had a very sort of Neanderthal approach to playing guitar. So by default, I gravitated towards playing in punk and hardcore bands.
I was going to say that automatically makes you more punk rock than
Yeah,
metal.
totally. So it wasn't until like much later that I got like, because I still loved metal, I still
Right.
like Slayer and like, Metallica, Megadeth and all those bands. And specifically like the stuff I started discovering, like Celtic Frost and Venom, which were
hmm
punk-esque. There's a feel to them, especially Celtic Frost. That was like, they were like a punk band, but they had like satanic lyrics and stuff. And that was the stuff I liked. I was into like the occult versions of music, but I was playing in these bands with, dudes who weren't into that kind of stuff. And then that wasn't until like, the '90s that I started,
How old were you when you had your first band, like proper band?
15.
That's pretty young.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was like just covers, like doing Ramones covers and things like that.
Sure.
But, we played shows, we played parties, like things like that.
hmm
But then when I went to college, I just kind of forgot about playing music really. Like, I played, but I was more interested in getting an education and, responsible
uh
things like that. And then it wasn't until after I graduated and sort of traveled a little bit and I started thinking about what I loved more than anything was being creative and just I'm not a halfway kind of guy. It's like if I'm going to do something,
Yeah.
I'm either going to not do it at all or I'm going to go full on and do it for real. So was the beginning of
Kind
that.
of the same way.
Yeah, that's the beginning of this whole decades long road to ruin that I've been on. So
I mean, it's for me, it's kind of why I don't actually play in a band these days is because I can't be somewhere in between. Like if I'm going to start a band, before I know it, I'm going to be all in,
yeah,
which means I have to like commit to, 2, 3 nights of rehearsal, and I practice on my own, and before I know it, I'm booking shows because I'm also the guy that like does all the stuff. Right, because every band has that one guy who sort of ends up carrying the majority of the weight of what it means to be in a band, whether it's like booking the shows or making posters or, I don't know if this is even still a thing anymore, but in my day, like going out at night and, stapling posters around Seattle. So, like right now I'm thinking of like, well, maybe I'm going to make a record again, but maybe I'm going to like, build a little studio in my backyard and get multi-track stuff and do that route and collaborate with people long distance. So record music, but not necessarily play out.
Well, feel free to contact me, man, if you need anything.
All right. Yeah,
Definitely.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of like my role too, was like, as I mentioned, my obsession with Black Flag and, Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski were like my idols, and the whole SST vibe was like the way
Right.
I was trying to live that ethos, and then throughout
that kind of DIY thing.
Yeah, just like, I read all the stuff that came out, the Rollins books and whatever, and it was just like talking about how they played every town, they played everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
And so my early bands that I played in had that same sort of motivation. Was like, I was in this band called Anodyne, and we were on like, labels put out our material, but we weren't, like a household name with anyone or anything like that. But we toured, I don't know, we did like 100 shows every year, basically. We would just go out on tour. For the most part, I booked everything, and
right.
And that was in the 90s where you had to have a landline and a telephone and all this other stuff. So as you can imagine, that was like,
And a lot of trips to the post office.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mailing out demos and, and there was a funny story that like, I was living in a house I lived in Boston for a while too. And this is like during that era where we had a house that we lived in, and it's like
the whole band.
3 out of the 4 guys lived there.
Okay.
And one guy had his other spot that he lived in, but there was always like people in and out of the house. And like one guy was on the couch and some dude was here for 2 months or whatever, I'm sure what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I know exactly. I've been in that house.
Yeah. So I had like this attic room and there was a connection for a phone. And I just saw the extension for the phone. So I plugged in the phone, right? And it turned out that whoever was living in that room was actually like an escort, okay? That had like their separate line that went to that room, okay? Because one day I picked up the phone and it was some guy calling to set up, a situation like that. So I was like, oh, okay, there's his phone number. So I just used that phone number to book like an entire tour, and then one day they shut it down. So.
And you never knew like who it was or where the bill went or any of that.
It was the oddest thing because I know when we were moving in, there were people moving out. Okay. And there was like this woman who lived in that room, she left this like box of, this is getting kind of weird actually now, but like
we like weird.
she left this,
weird is good.
She left this box of stuff like in the closet of that, well, actually there was no closet in that room. It was just the floor basically because it was the attic, right?
Right.
So it was like the eaves of the, so there was like this corner that she's like, oh, I'm going to come back and get that stuff. I'm like, all right, whatever, cool. So after a month or so living there, I opened up the box because I figured she's not going to ever come back to get this stuff. And there was like a journal in there and all this other creepy stuff. So, so that's how I realized that, she was a sex worker that lived in this room. And it's just part of this whole thing was this telephone line. But this is all in the course of like 4 weeks, and then like week 6, they shut the phone off because we were running up builds to like, calls to like Sioux Falls, South Dakota and like Seattle, Washington, and Bellingham and, Spokane and places like that. So it's like,
So you tour the whole country.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. We, back then it was like you could live on like $5 a day, in the early 90s and none of us really, our rent was like, like $150 or something like that. So we all had jobs. We were able to put away some money to pay for like, a couple weeks or whatever, make our rent for the month. And there was no one had a credit card or anything like that. So there was no debts or anything like that. So yeah, those were like the, the early days of just going for it, and it was cool.
Yeah.
And, as time goes on, you have different aspirations of doing different things on a higher level.
That's kind of where you are now, right? With Tombs?
Yeah. Tombs, like definitely, because that band was active up until like 2004 or something like that.
Okay.
2003, maybe. Oh, maybe later than that. But anyway, so I did another band in between then, and that didn't really go anywhere. And then on a completely like, I just want to make music that I like, kind of sentiment, I started writing more music and was working with a drummer. And that's just like, with no expectation that it would go anywhere. Because originally, like the band that I was doing between Tombs and Anodyne, a lot of people were like, "Oh yeah, this is going to be like, you guys, all these different members from these different bands, and you guys are going to like have like,
Super
super
group.
group or whatever, right?" So that didn't really pan out. So I was like, you know what, fuck it,
Hmm.
man. I'm just gonna go back to making music I want to listen to.
Sure.
And then that's how we started doing Tombs. And little did I know people cared about the band enough to like legitimate labels were interested in working with us. So
Right.
you know,
I don't know. I would tell any young person starting a band that what you just said is what they should be doing. Like, just basically make the music you want to hear. I did an episode last season with Conan Neutron. He's got this band, Conan Neutron Secret Friends, and he has a podcast that's been going for 11 years. But one of the things he said in the conversation that we had was like, I wanted to make the music I wanted to hear. And I'm like, bingo, ding, ding. And the thing is that then you'll never ultimately be disappointed because your motivation is to do that creative thing that feels the most authentic and pure to kind of what you want to do. And if you see success from there, that's fantastic. But you're not doing it to try to become successful ahead of the actual creative process itself.
yeah, and as time went on, then we started getting bigger and bigger opportunities, to play festivals and tours and all this other stuff and touring with like bigger bands. And I would do in this band long enough too to see bands sort of come and go. You know what I mean? We would do this tour with a band who was like, oh yeah, they're going to be like the next, gigantic thing, right? So,
Uh-huh.
and they're just into it for different reasons, and I was into it. It was like, they're like one guy's like real concerned about how many T-shirts they sold every night, which is like, I get that. You got to make this thing work. Totally.
Sure.
I don't know. That's something you keep to yourself. You know what I mean? Like, hey man, how was the show today? Oh, we sold like 200 T-shirts, and I'm like, that's not what I'm asking you, dude. It's like,
Right.
how did you play? Like, how was the playing part? And they come and go, man. And it's like,
Uh-huh.
you can tell that their songs are tailored to a certain type of thing, and it's like,
Right.
I mean, that's cool if you're into that. But then again, who am I to say anything? Because like, well, we're not like household name or some massive band or
Sure.
anything. But I feel satisfied.
You're not doing well enough to say, no, the band isn't making a living from from the band.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there were definitely years where it was my only income though, because I wasn't able to hold a
uh-huh.
job. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I made a living doing it.
How long has Tombs been active as a band at this point?
17 years, man.
That's wild.
Yeah, that doesn't seem that long.
How many of the original members are
It's
still
just me, really. I mean, that's
just you?
yeah. I mean,
It's kind of your band, and those people come and go.
it,
And
it, it would be really easy to say that, but
uh-huh.
it's almost like how like Deep Purple had all these different Mark One, Mark Two. There was like the
Right.
version of the band that had these guys in it. Then there was like the David Coverdale years, whatever. Or actually, he was in Rainbow, but actually, no, David Coverdale wasn't Deep Purple. But anyway, so I look at it more like that, where this is the Path to Totality era. That was the Under Sullen Skies era is the one that we're in right now. Because literally this version of the band is the most collaborative the band's ever been. So
Hmm.
I can't claim credit for everything we've done. I could just be like,
Right.
yeah, I'm part of the band, and maybe I'm the vision, the director of things. But because I'm playing with such great musicians right now, like everyone pretty much contributes,
Hmm.
like writing.
How does that feel to you compared to, say, times in the band when you've been the primary creative force?
I like it better because things outside of music, I have been able to tame my ego to the point where I just want to do what will give the best result. And that means like the most satisfying output. And to do that, sometimes you have to be open to other people's ideas, and it's like, maybe in the beginning I was more like had a stranglehold on all the writing, but,
Uh-huh.
these days I play with guys, they're such incredible musicians and have such mature ideas about what to do with music. And they're also technically way beyond my capabilities of playing too. So it's like if they have ideas, usually it works really well. And, we wouldn't be playing in a band together if we didn't share the same aesthetics. So it makes sense.
At what point did you decide, hey, I'm in a band, I'm going to start doing a podcast? Was that sort of a logical outgrowth, or was it a completely separate thought process?
Actually, it came more out of writing than doing the band, because there was a period of time where I was doing a lot of freelance writing for like, music journalism type stuff, like interviews. I interviewed people, and, I had stuff that came out like, on Noisy and Revolver, like the usual
Right.
places. Didn't really like doing that, but so I figured like, you know what, maybe this would be really cool to just go off and do this thing on my own and have people that I thought was interesting on the show, and just not just musical people. I have tons of people on there.
Well, especially, yeah, everything went black. I mean, it's very different, but there are those parallels between what I'm trying to do and what you're already doing, in that it sort of leans more into music because that's kind of where we live and what we know best and most. But you're also getting other kinds of people who are involved in other kind of creative things, or in some cases, just creative thinkers.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that's like was more satisfying, that urge to do those things, to converse with people.
Uh-huh.
Podcasting was definitely not a big thing when we first started doing it. So yeah, it was fun, and similar to the band, I didn't have any aspirations to do anything with it. I just was like, well, this is another thing to do.
It's it's an
Yeah,
outlet.
it's another outlet, and that's my approach to pretty much everything I do. It's like I create stuff without any idea that it's gonna be listened to or read, or
Hmm.
unless it's like a work for hire type of thing. And I just kinda let it go from there, and it's like if people like it, cool. If not, I'm still gonna continue doing it, and
Which came first, Everything Went Black or
everything went
Necromaniacs?
black. But shortly after that, I feel like Necro came maybe a couple of years later, and that was just because I love horror films, and I like genre movies in general,
Hmm.
and I also think that horror films and literature gets kind of shorted in a lot of ways by people who fancy themselves to be elevated with their tastes in a way.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring a little bit more of that kind of analytical touch to things, and
Also within cinema, horror is often overlooked,
yeah, no, definitely.
as being a serious genre or a serious medium. And yet, I feel like over the last several years anyway, there's been an incredible amount of horror that has been this sort of next level. There's a lot of horror that feels less like genre in a way.
I'm actually working on a project right now, a writing project about horror in the 21st century. And I feel like a lot of what we're experiencing right now in horror, like the kind of, A24 type films, really owe a lot to the new French extremity, which was like late 90s European genre films. And throughout the 90s, I was like, American horror is dead, because I was like, there was nothing that came out that I really enjoyed. Like, I didn't like any of the, Wes Craven Scream films or any of that kind of stuff. And then, the same way I discovered interesting music, I found interesting films. So like,
Hmm.
I started reading, or not reading, but like, yeah, reading a lot of zines about horror, and discovering, the European films, like the new French extremity movies, like Claire Denis, and, people who were
Hmm.
straddling different genres, who actually were more like, maybe they started out doing dramas and then incorporating these like extreme elements into the films, and then created this genre films, like horror films,
Right,
Alessandro
right.
Aja, like people like that. And then also Japanese cinema, Japanese films, and then all the Italian, the
All
great
the Giallo
Italian,
stuff.
the
Right.
giallo
Yeah.
films, and Sergio Martino, Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci,
Yeah.
like all those guys, Michele
They're
Soavi.
such visually rich films too, above and beyond their genre.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Especially like Michele Soavi doesn't have too many films compared to like the others, but like his Della Morte e dell'Amore film, I think, is like, that film itself influenced a lot of the Tombs like writing, but like the sort of ideas that I was having in the beginning of the band were sort of inspired by that film.
In terms of theme or feel or color or texture or just sort of all of it.
It's like watching the film, and the feelings I got from that film
Okay.
translated into making music in a lot of, you
Right.
know what I mean? Like Suavi in that film had such an eye for like these dramatic, like dark beauty, and I mean, it doesn't hurt that he had that Danish actress in the film that plays the lead in there, Anna Falchi. She's a pretty easy lady to make look beautiful in films, but the way that he captured a lot of the sort of scenes with her, and like the ossuary scene with the skulls and death and all this stuff, was like very like influential on the first couple records that we did.
I guess it makes sense. Also, there's that whole connection between horror as a film genre and heavy metal as a musical form.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Like there always seemed to have been sort of that connection.
yeah, I mean, and honestly, even my interest in horror, I think, stems from, listening to Black Sabbath, like back. I mean,
Sure.
the Black Sabbath, it's a Mario Bava film, right?
Right. And it's funny, every time I look at that record cover of the first Black Sabbath record, my brain always goes back to a similar shot in black and white in the 1961 film, The Innocents.
Yeah, I saw that a couple of years ago. Actually, that was like,
Yeah.
yeah, I haven't. I only saw that one time. Yeah.
So I actually have a story about that and Repo Man too. For years and years, when I lived in Seattle, the Seattle International Film Festival is one of the longer running film festivals in North America. And one interesting thing about it is the duration of the entire festival, I think, is longer than any other festival that happens. It's like 2.5 or 3.5 weeks, I forget. But one of the most popular parts of that festival you can buy tickets for is called the Secret Film Festival.
Oh, sounds cool.
And every Sunday they have a matinee, and you buy the whole package. It's usually the first thing that sells out. You don't know what you're going to see until you're literally in the theater, and they do a little pre-announcement and they tell you what we're going to see. And the whole thing is like, you can't tell anybody, it's a secret, right? And sometimes they show you world premieres. Sometimes they show you restorations of films that nobody's seen for 20 years, all kinds of different things. One year, the film that they showed was The Innocents. And the thing about it was it had actually been banned for like 30 years. Or maybe it's 25 years. When it first came out, the psychosexual themes of like the children in Britain, since 1961, freaked the censors out too much, and it just seemed like too much. They literally pulled the film from being seen anywhere for, I think it was like 25 years.
Wow.
And so this was a special treat. This was like this whole new restoration before it was actually officially being released for the first time. And I just remember being absolutely blown away. And at one point I remember just like all the hairs on my arms were sticking up because it's such a quiet, subtle film, but it's so psychologically powerful. The other film one year was Repo Man.
Really?
And this was a production cut a year ahead of release, and they didn't even have all the credits in, and it was like a slightly different cut. But try to imagine seeing Repo Man, having never had any knowledge of it, having never heard most of the music, cold. You've never seen this film before, and suddenly that pops on the screen, and you're just like, what? And then the whole thing's this wild ride. Like, those are actually my two favorite stories of movies that I saw as part of the Secret Film Festival. So it's interesting that we both brought that both of them have come up in this conversation.
What were your thoughts about Repo Man the first time, like when you saw it?
I was ecstatic and blown away and overjoyed with, because it was just so cool and fun and weird. I mean, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And the music was such a big part of it, especially like that scene at the open where the trunk opens up and all of a sudden the light and the car pulls away and you just see two boots without a person in it anymore. And then the Iggy Pop song kicks in and you're just like, like that sets the entire tone for the whole thing. Repo Man's one of my favorite films of all time. And I have a lot of favorite films of all time for sure.
I'd have to agree with that for me too. I mean, just even like the Plugs, like they're they did a lot of the instrumental, like sort of more score part of the film. I can go on and on about that movie. I love that movie so much.
It may be time. It's been a few years since I've watched it, and it's probably time to watch it again. If you're enjoying this conversation, please make sure you hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. It's the quickest way to grow our channel, and it's absolutely free. You can also subscribe to our other channels on social media. Check out our Instagram at Creative Asylum CA, that's the letter CA, or on TikTok at The Creative Asylum, that's all one word. Our website is thecapod.com, and our Facebook profile is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. All right. Back to the episode. So what are some of the recent films you've seen in the last couple of years in terms of horror that you've really liked? Have you seen Weapons?
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I'm a Zach Kreger fan. It surpasses Barbarian. I thought that was really cool. Let's see. I just saw another film. It's called Strange Harvest. It's interesting because it's like combining like true crime and like Lovecraftian cosmic horror. And I like slow atmospheric movies.
Mm-hmm.
The whole Lovecraft universe, like the Cthulhu mythos, like all that stuff is some of my favorite stuff. And all the people surrounding Lovecraft, I love, like, Clark Ashton Smith and like all these guys. Yeah, it follows the trajectory of this like serial killer. For half of the film, you think, okay, I know where this is going.
Right.
But then there's like a whole other element that comes in. And at the end of the film, you don't even know if anything really happened or not. It's cool. It's like,
Okay.
you don't know if this cosmic entity actually entered our dimension or if this is all a construct by the person that they're,
Right.
that was caught. And it's a
Right.
fantastic film, low budget, not even a lot of gore effects. It's all atmosphere,
I prefer that.
Yeah.
I mean, you were saying about a lot of the horror films in the 90s that were just kind of slasher jump scares. Like, those are the horror films I've never had that much interest in.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of those, really. It's
I really the psychological aspects and the atmospheric aspects and, sort of the whole visual component. I think it's such a more effective way to sort of plumb those inner depths of your psyche and really kind of find where your fear lies. Like, you can see somebody's head get cut off and you're like, oh, but it doesn't have the same effect. It's not as likely to seep into your dreams.
I like stuff that's more like preternatural as opposed to supernatural. I mean, like,
Mhm.
it's like maybe this internal sort of thing where you're experiencing like your perspective on what's happening may or may not be connected to a larger consciousness, or maybe you're completely just in your own head. And I think a lot of Thomas Ligotti's like fiction is like that too, where maybe nothing's really happening at all. Maybe it's just this internal thing that you're experiencing.
I don't know
Oh
him.
man, dude, he's my dog, man. I love Thomas
Really?
Ligotti. He's the greatest.
Okay.
Yeah. Teatro Grotesco, man. That's the one to get. A lot of it has to do with just like consciousness and like the pessimistic philosophy of like life just being this illusion between nothingness, before and after, and it's like this idea that anything that's supernatural is actually just like an abstraction of like your own ideas, maybe, and maybe what you're seeing as being supernatural is just like a layer of the universe being peeled away, and you're seeing something for what it truly is, that sort of
Mhm.
stuff. And that's my jam right there. I love all that stuff.
That sounds cool. I'll check it out for sure. So, slightly related, slightly different from the year before. I'm curious what you thought of the film The Substance. That's just popped into my head.
I really liked it. It was on my, top films of the year list.
Me too.
And it was because of the fact that Demi Moore was in it and she had sort of a comeback with that film.
Mhm.
I think that having her in the film really made a statement about our perception of aging and the male projection of like female beauty. So there's these higher concepts that are in the film, but then there's
Yeah.
straight up just like sick, like body horror, you know what I mean? Which is like awesome. That's like another genre that I love, like Cronenberg.
It was so completely insane.
Yeah.
If I had any criticism of the film, it would probably be that last section of the film. The body horror was kind of so over the top that it felt kind of goofy.
I could dig that. Yeah.
But I still enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But I was like, it just seemed like such a hard turn that I was like, this is cool. This is weird.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely unique, man.
It was on my top 10 for the year. And I watched it, the second time I watched it, only a month or two after the first time I watched it. And I kind of had the same reaction. It's like, I liked everything about it, and I sort of liked but didn't love how hard they turned into that horror piece of it. I think had it been the same idea but not quite so just completely vivid and over the top in the presentation, but hey, who am I to judge? I've never made a film. I watch a ridiculous number of films.
My wife and I saw that. We saw that in the theater, and
Did you?
yeah, and it was out at the Claremont, out in like this town called Montclair in New Jersey. It's like this kind of
Uh-huh.
like, upwardly mobile like town, and they have this kind of an art house cinema there.
Yeah.
And maybe they weren't expecting this type of film. The place was actually pretty packed, actually, which I was excited.
Mhm.
I was glad that a lot of people came out, but there was these like people in front of us who were like, oh my God. You know, they were like, oh gracious, goodness gracious. You know, like they were like clutching their pearls. And I
Right.
was like, oh, this is great. You know?
What did you think you were going to see?
Yeah. And I think seeing it in the theater, like kind of like the over the top part at the end was like a little bit more on brand, you know, because you're seeing on this big screen, everything's like larger than life, you know, that kind of thing.
I just really love that it was such a completely unexpected film, totally out of left field. It was pretty wild. It was pretty outrageous. And it just kind of hit. It caught the attention of so many different people and, got nominations. Like I was like, this should get nominations, but is it gonna? And it did. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. There's just that it got the attention because it was, it's still kind of unlike any horror film you've seen,
Pretty much. I mean, you
right?
know, you can see the influence of like David Cronenberg, you know, definitely,
Sure.
but it's definitely its own thing for sure.
What do you think of Cronenberg's son's films?
Oh, yeah, I definitely like Brandon Cronenberg. Possessor, I think it's probably his best film so far.
Possessor's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering over time if he's going to create films that will slowly differentiate himself a little more from, I think of body horror. I think it's obvious that you just think of Cronenberg as the creator of the genre, even if maybe he's not. I don't know. Like when I think of body horror, I always go back to like Videodrome.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That was the film of his that first and foremost just made me go, whoa. When I was that 80s, I think, right?
Yeah, it was in the 80s, definitely. I saw that on VHS.
Yeah, I think I probably did too for the first time. But, that was when I was doing the whole Seattle music thing, label playing music, and Videodrome was kind of front and center in the front of my brain as sort of part of all of that.
Videodrome may be one of my top films by him, actually.
I would probably say so.
Yeah, I really enjoy that one. I'm really into Robert Eggers too. Like pretty much
Yes.
all of his movies. They're all different. They're all period pieces, which I really appreciate. You know, and I'm looking forward to not Beowulf, Werewolf coming out, which is like
Okay, that's Eggers.
yeah, it's his next project is Werewolf.
Very cool. What did you watch the Del Toro Frankenstein film?
Yeah, you
I
know,
was very excited to see it, and I walked away being very disappointed by it.
there was just something missing. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And it's like
Well, for one thing, the monster was just like, I'm sorry, too damn pretty.
yeah, I agree.
And it's interesting. People either loved the performance of the Baron or hated the performance, of the doctor.
Yeah, Victor.
I thought Victor was great, but I read a lot of people online like, oh, he just ruined the film. Like, really? I thought he made the film. I thought the monster ruined the film. I wouldn't say ruin. I enjoyed it, but it just seemed like there was this amazing opportunity to make like the best Frankenstein ever made, and didn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like, yeah, some of the like elements of the novel are present,
Mhm.
you know, but I read that book every couple of years, like that and like Bram Stoker, like Dracula, like all the classics, you know. I always run through those, like The King in Yellow, like short stories, like Lovecraft, like all that stuff. I reread
Uh-huh.
those nonstop. My takeaway from I think the last time I read Frankenstein was more about like that kind of like material versus spiritual sort of what life really is. And I was kind of hoping that someone in 2025, you know, would make a film that addressed that, you know, more than just
Right.
like a retelling of like the same, you know, material that's been out there already.
With just Del Toro graphics.
Yeah.
The visuals were beautiful.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For my money, I'll take the remake of Nosferatu,
That was fantastic. Yeah.
which a lot of people didn't like, and I thought was spectacular.
Yeah. We saw that on Christmas Day, actually, me and my wife.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering what's in store for you in 2026. Do you have specific things that you're focusing on, or do you just kind of continue to move forward?
I continue to move forward, but I have a bunch of other projects besides Tombs that I'm going to be spending more time doing. A project called Begotten Sons, which
Uh-huh.
a few years ago we did an EP, and there's more material with that coming out, and that's more I don't know how to describe it. It's more slow, emotional kind of stuff with like clean singing and you know synthesizers and stuff like that, and
Okay.
you know electronics. And then there's Scorpion Throne, which is kind of like this like depressive black metal band, not as brutal but like more downbeat stuff.
Uh-huh.
And then there's another band that I'm like more of a collaborator in this one. It's called Hollow Lands. It's me and Drew Goth from Australia. He has a band. He does a lot of stuff. Carl Hakara, who's a fellow podcaster. And that's almost like it's different than any of the material that the three of us have done. Like those guys have all worked more in like this kind of like extreme war metal, black metal world. And this project Hollowlands is more like Samhain or like TSOL or something like that.
Mhm.
So there'll be more of that material. And then Tombs is going to be releasing a split with a band called Putrescension that's based out here. And that's probably the next Tombs thing we got going on, besides touring and, playing shows and
Right,
stuff like
right.
that.
So clearly you're a creative slacker.
Oh, I forgot to mention Vasilek, my electronics, ambient band. So that stuff will be.
So do you have a regular day
Oh
job?
yeah, dude, I'm doing it right now. I'm like sitting in my office,
Oh,
you
okay.
know.
It sounds like you've got a hell of a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
2 questions.
Okay.
1, what is it specifically about metal that excites you and drives you?
I find that metal, honestly, is probably one of the more open genres. Like you can incorporate all sorts of things into that genre,
Uh-huh.
and it can weave in all sorts of influences, and people generally are down to like at least check it out. It's like, even with Tombs, like we have the obvious influences, but there's also quite a bit of death rock and like gothic stuff in there, and the Swans, like bands like that are
Uh-huh.
definitely
Uh-huh.
woven in there, and people are accepting of it. Stuff like punk and hardcore, and it's very regimented as to what you can do. Like it's very
Right.
restrictive. It's like you can only do certain things, or otherwise people will be like, they'll just reject it. Because I mean, Tombs
Right.
we've toured with hardcore bands before too. We did this one particular tour with a band that I really like a lot, and we're on paper, if you listen to both bands side by side, there's not that much difference between their music, right?
Uh-huh.
We would play, and there would be the crowd of people that like our music would be there. They would leave, and then all the guys that were waiting outside would file in and then
Oh, weird.
watch the other band that went on. And even the singer of that band would say things after the second or third show. He was just like, don't you guys realize this is all the same stuff? This is the same shit that we're doing here.
Right.
And it's like, because it is really, I mean, it's like, because, as punk used to be more about like freedom, it used to be more about like,
Well, at least in theory it did.
yeah. You could have a band like
So
Firehose, you have Minutemen, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Dead Kennedys. They all sound different, right?
yeah, they do.
The Screamers.
Well, just like, Seattle grunge is made up by a bunch of bands that don't sound alike. That all sound different.
Yeah.
It's a weird human tendency where people feel they need to put everything in a little box and sort of put a label on it,
Yeah.
I released a CD years ago of a band from El Paso, Texas. Their first 2 records on a CD, a band called the Rhythm Pigs. They toured a lot and they were known within their little world. But on their second record, they put out a song called Big Brother's Little Brother. And the lyrics are maximum rock and roll, Big Brother's Little Brother. And the whole thing is basically an indictment of how maximum rock and roll, as sort of the arbiter of punk, passed judgment on, are you punk enough? And are you punk in the right way? And they're like, it's kind of like what you're saying. It's like, isn't punk all about independence? It's not about trying to wear the uniform. And yet so much of punk rock has ended up being that way. You're this kind of punk, you're this kind of punk. And if you go outside of the lines, you're sort of looked down upon. And that does seem like such a weird contradiction to what is on paper acceptable and what is on paper presumed to be sort of the ideal of true independence. And yet, are you wearing do you have the right hair, and are you wearing the right boots? Like, who gives a shit? Are you listening to the right music? Well, yeah, it's music I like. That's the right music.
Yeah.
So with all these projects you're involved in, clearly you are driven to do a lot of things and to have your fingers in many different pots. So I guess my final question to you is what is it in your life about the things that you do creativity that just continues to push you forward and always want to be kind of exploring these different areas?
Well, I mean, it's probably going to sound cliched and, but it's like, I just have to do it. I mean, there's like things, once the idea germinates in my head, it's like sand. It's like I have like a tack in my shoe or something that I have to get out. You know what I mean? It's like this thing that's bothering me that I haven't finished it. It's something that's, it has to be realized, and then, I was constantly thinking about death and the end of life, and because the last few years, I've lost so many people in this world,
Yeah,
and I'm just,
really?
yeah, and
That's too
I'm
bad.
like, I could die tomorrow, man. I could get hit by a
Yeah.
car or like, shot in the streets or something like that. But like the end of life and not realizing all these things is what motivates me to like continue doing stuff that it would be a shame if I didn't at least substance to these ideas that I had,
Uh-huh.
and like, it's all, it's like this kind of solipsistic thing too, because it's like it's for me though, it's not like I have this like need to share it with people necessarily, even though I do, which is ironic too, right?
Uh-huh.
But, it's more just so I can, like, play on my computer or my phone or whatever and listen back to this stuff and be like, "Alright, it's done," and then put it
Mhm.
aside and forget about it?
Then there's the next thing. There's always a next thing.
Yeah, there's always something to go towards, which you know, is really what keeps me going through all this stuff.
I'm just always interested in, there is a certain type of person who seems to always be driven by this desire to create something out of nothing.
That's it right there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Creative Asylum. A quick favor before you go. If you liked this conversation, please be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Tuesday at 10. You can find us on Instagram and on YouTube at Creative Asylum CA. That's Creative Asylum and the letters CA. Our website is thecapod.com. And our Facebook is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. Until next week, when we'll have a new conversation with another creative disruptor, stay creative in life and at work.